Thank you, Vincente. Very happy to be back at the Foundation. I'd like to say thank you for that. Thank you to BBVA for making it possible. I'm Don Rissmiller, Chief Economist at Strategas and the GIC Chair for this year. So I'd like to tell you a little about GIC, the Global Interdependence Center. It started in 1976, which was an important year in American history because it was a celebration of independence. And so at that time, there were a group of individuals in Philadelphia, which was a center of celebration, who decided it was important not just to think about independence, but to think about interdependence in a global context. And that's where the organization got its start. And we feel it is especially important today, in light of everything going on across the globe, to continue that mission. So if you're interested in GIC, you can check out interdependence.org. We are happy to be here in Madrid. We have upcoming trips that include Philadelphia, but also Havana, Cuba, Sarasota, Florida, and Salt Lake City, Utah. Should you have any interest in those, I'd be happy to tell you more about that. Let me turn it over to Jorge Cecilia, Chief Economist, BBVA, to continue.
Thank you so much. I would like to give you a warm welcome to this event. On behalf of BBVA, we're very proud. I'm very proud to say that we're extremely happy to co-sponsor this event, and especially happy to welcome here Raphael Bostic to share his views on the global economy, but more in particular on the U.S. economy, monetary policy, and a whole range of issues in which he is especially knowledgeable. Also, I believe this is the first time that he has been invited to Madrid to give his remarks, so I'm very happy. I welcome you here, and I hope that you have a chance to come back again to continue sharing your views. So without further ado, I just give the floor to Jaime Caruana.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Good evening. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome Raphael Bostic. I think he has been introduced. He's the chair of the Atlanta Fed, but not only that, he's a voting member of the FOMC, and therefore he has two important capacities. He's in charge of monetary policy, but he's also in charge of regulation, supervision of banks. So I think he brings to this dialogue full curriculum, both in policy making and also in academia. And I was very interested in your specialty in academia. You have been focused on housing, finance, housing, and I think housing has been a very important issue in the past crisis. So I think looking from the housing perspective, it must be very interesting to analyze what are the important issues for monetary policy, what are the lessons looking at what happened in housing for monetary policy. But I think that will come probably after your presentation. So I wouldn't like to say more, and I would like to, again, welcome you and ask you to take the floor. Thank you very much for coming and being here today.
Hola, buenas tardes. Gracias. Muy bien, muy bien. Thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. It's an honor to be here among so many distinguished colleagues from across the globe. I was reflecting on my flight across to Madrid that this is my second event associated with the Global Interdependence Center. My first was in the U.S. in Florida when I spoke at their second annual Financial Literacy Day. And that program was excellent. It was actually quite good. And I found that this program here has been at least as good. It's given me much to think about, and I very much enjoyed it. I'd also like to thank the Fundación Rafael del Pino for hosting the event as a partner with GIC and BBVA. I've been very impressed with the Foundation's activities, and I look forward to engaging more with them in the future. So thanks to Maria, Vicente, and the FRP team. This is my first visit to Madrid, as you know. It's been a really nice visit, and there's a lot to see here, and I've enjoyed myself quite a bit. And I've also had to brush off my Spanish, which was rusty, and we'll just leave it at that. People have been very kind to me, so I've enjoyed Madrid. Turning to more serious things, we are now just about a week past the latest Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC meeting, and understandably, a lot of attention was focused on what signal the committee might send about the near-term path of the federal funds rate. In my remarks this evening, I would like to shift the focus away from the how many more moves question. Instead, I'm going to talk about the framework that informs my thinking about monetary policy in terms of both where we've been and the risks we might consider in defining the next phase of our policy. In particular, I'm going to address what further adjustments might be needed to get to a neutral policy, and be mindful that the answer could be none. Now, as you know, or as you may know, what I'm going to say tonight are my opinions only. Nothing I say necessarily reflects the thinking of my FOMC colleagues or anybody else in the Federal Reserve System. So it's just me, and you can take it at that. All right, so let's begin the story in late 2015. Just about 3 years ago, the FOMC began the process of normalizing its monetary policy stance. The committee moved the target range for the federal funds rate up from the near zero floor that had been in place since December of 2008. Now, at that time, the unemployment rate stood at 5%, and that's a rate about half the level that it had been at the worst point of the crisis. Gracias. The initial increase in the policy target was modest, a 25 basis point rise. And that gradual increase, or that gradual pace, has become characteristic of the policy path since then. So even with the first upward adjustment in the funds rate target, policy remained incredibly accommodative. And given the facts on the ground, continued accommodation was fully justified. In its statement and published projections, the committee noted that there was still room for improvement in labor markets. And perhaps more important, inflation remained a distance from the FOMC's longer-run price stability objective. At the time, core inflation was expected to come in well below 2% for 2015, and not to recover fully until this year. Given that the road of an economic forecaster is usually a rocky one, it's worth noting that the FOMC's outlook was amazingly prescient. On a year-over-year basis, core inflation, as measured by the price index for personal consumption expenditures, which we call PCE, was a mere 1.3% by the end of 2015. The inflation rate did not consistently reach our target neighborhood of 2% until this year. Now, by 2017, the FOMC had moved its target range for federal funds rate up by a full percentage point, and key economic performance metrics had continued to improve. The inflation outlook had progressed roughly as anticipated, and the unemployment rate had fallen further to 4.3%, far surpassing our expectations. So the committee decided to take the next step in the normalization process by announcing that it would slowly shrink the size of the Fed's balance sheet, which had more than quadrupled in the wake of the crisis. The balance sheet normalization strategy was formulated under two guiding principles. The first was to implement the wind down in a manner that would not disrupt financial markets. The second was to put the balance sheet rundown in the background, if you will, with the goal of placing the focus on ongoing policy adjustments via the traditional interest rate challenge or channel. For these reasons, the committee chose a process that was phased in, that was gradual, and based on a relatively fixed schedule. And by most accounts, mine included, this strategy has been successful on both fronts. And that brings us to today. As I've noted, inflation is effectively at the FOMC's longer-run 2% objective. The unemployment rate has fallen even further to 3.7%, and this is a level that has not been sustained for at least half a century. So we are very close to the FOMC's other key goal, which is promoting maximum sustainable employment growth. And possibly, we have gone some measure beyond that. Now, this is a record of great progress, and I believe that it is at least in part a result of the FOMC's deliberate but patient removal of monetary accommodation. In my view, conditions warrant the final steps in removing any remaining accommodation and adopting a neutral stance of monetary policy. The question now is as complicated as it is straightforward. What further adjustments are necessary to get to neutral? Now, in a recent speech, Fed Chairman Jay Powell emphasized the role that risk management plays in the FOMC's decision-making. He explained how an important element of good policy is calibrating it to manage both upside and downside risk. And I couldn't agree more. As I noted in a speech last month that I delivered in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, with the economy performing well and with monetary policy seemingly within shouting distance of neutral, the FOMC faces both upside and downside risks with its next set of policy adjustments. And I'm going to get some water. Oh, there's water here. I see there's water here already. I got to pay more attention. So as I see it, the committee now must balance the risks of stopping short of full normalization and risking an overheated economy, which is going to be unstable, against the risk of going too far and short-circuiting an otherwise sustainable expansion. And I will speak to each of these risks in turn. Is there a risk of being too timid for too long? The answer is yes. And that risk would start with my earlier observation that the current level of the unemployment rate is historically quite low. Not only is the current rate at 3.7%, but as reflected in the Federal Reserve's Summary of Economic Projections in September, the consensus of FOMC participants is that this level will be maintained for at least the next 3 years. A sustained unemployment rate at 3.7% or below has been seen only twice since World War II, and not at all since the late 1960s. And perhaps more to the point, the current level of the unemployment rate is below that which the consensus of the committee views as sustainable in the long run. The central tendency in the FOMC participants' latest projections ranges from 4.3 to 4.6%. Now, I'll show what many would consider a disturbing picture. Now, this picture highlights periods of time when the actual unemployment rate fell below what the U.S. Congressional Budget Office now estimates as the so-called natural rate of unemployment. I refer to these episodes as high-pressure periods, and they are shown in red. Now, here's the punchline. Dating back to 1960, every high-pressure period ended in a recession. And all but one recession was preceded by a high-pressure period. And the one exception was part of a double recession, so most people say that doesn't count. All right, so there are many possible interpretations for the leading relationship between high-pressure periods and downturns in the economy. One is that this relationship is entirely spurious, and that would be a pretty benign interpretation. I'm not convinced that such an interpretation is consistent with good risk management practice. Rather, I think a risk management approach requires that we at least consider the possibility that unemployment rates that are lower than normal for an extended period are symptoms of an overheated economy. And one possible consequence of overheating is that decision-making in the private sector becomes increasingly risky, and imbalances, especially in financial markets, build. Now, as of yet, there does not appear to be evidence of widespread imbalances in the United States. But I am not taking the current situation for granted. As an example, I have my eye on some recent evidence in the U.S. consumer credit market that I think bears watching. We have seen rising delinquencies on consumer credit cards on small banks. Now, while they are not currently driving the core of the market, rising delinquencies that manifest in the small bank sector may spill out and become a broader issue. So while the aggregate picture is still a healthy one, these pockets of concern call for a more careful scrutiny of risks. Another consequence of overheating is that inflationary pressures inevitably build up, leading the central bank, in turn, to respond aggressively. And economic weakness usually follows. Now, you might argue that the simple answer is just not to respond aggressively to building signs of inflation. But that would entail risks that few responsible central bankers would accept. It is true that the Fed and most other advanced economy central banks have the luxury of solid credibility for achieving and maintaining their price stability goals. But we shouldn't forget that such credibility was hard-won. Inflation expectations are stable for now, but we know little about how far the scales can tip before that is no longer the case. So with apologies to Joni Mitchell, when it comes to inflation expectations, you don't know what you got till it's gone. And I don't think it would be a good idea to find out. Do you know who Joni Mitchell is? All right, so some people said, of course, but I work with a lot of young people now, and I'm never so sure. All right, so just as there are risks to too timid policy adjustments, there are decidedly risks to policy adjustments that are too aggressive. The main uncertainty, as I see it, is that it is very difficult to determine when the economy is actually overheating, especially when inflationary signals across the board remain subdued. Consider, for example, the task of determining the normal rate of unemployment. My definition of normal is a sustainable level that avoids overheating in the economy. I would have pegged an unemployment rate of around 5% as normal when the committee started down the path of normalization in 2015. My view now is that the longer-run normal rate of unemployment today is a good deal closer to 4% than that original 5%. Estimating the capacity of the economy, about which the unemployment rate is just one measure, is extremely difficult, not least because it can be a moving target. One example of this is the behavior of the U.S. labor force participation rate. Now, most economists accept that the secular trend of the participation rate in the United States is negative, due in large part to the aging of the population. But the overall rate ticked up in the latest report and has been basically flat for the past several years. The labor force participation rate of prime-age U.S. workers, especially women, has actually been on the rise. Now, we have no solid interpretation for this trend, but it is reasonable to suspect that the larger flows of workers into the labor market, smaller flows of unemployed workers out of the labor market, and still relatively modest wage pressures are all signs that there may be more slack in labor markets than typically assumed. Now, I found another example that capacity may be more flexible than we might think in a recent report from my staff. The Atlanta Fed collects anecdotal information from businesses throughout our district, and that's the southeastern United States. These field reports, which are collected as part of what we call the Regional Economic Information Network, or RAIN as an acronym, have for some time included reports of acute shortages in the trucking industry. In our most recent reports, we heard something quite interesting. the recent implementation of technologies that monitor and help to enforce restrictions on how long truck drivers can be on the clock has leveled the playing field in the industry. So we've just added a new requirement that truckers have to have an automated clock in their cab as they drive. And it keeps time rather than the driver keeping time on their own. This could put pressure because if you're sitting in traffic, it used to be that you as truck drivers just wouldn't put that time down. But if you have an automated clock, now that time is going to count, which means that the amount of time that they actually can drive over the course of a day is reduced. It shrinks. All right, so what's happened? The competitive pressures, these pressures in the industry, have resulted in trucking companies urging their customers to adopt processes that have resulted in less downtime as drivers wait for their cargo to be unloaded. In short, the customers now unload trucks faster so that the clock time in that portion is reduced. So this faster turnaround time has actually increased capacity in the industry. And this increased capacity is a result of greater efficiency and not greater numbers of trucks or of truck drivers. Now, I don't know if this sort of development is a game changer, but it was notable to me that this anecdote came from one of the sectors that has persistently cited capacity strains. And it was notable at least as a reminder that capacity is always a slippery concept. In addition to the hazards of defining a concept like overheating, there are some rather straightforward downside macroeconomic risks that I'm pretty sure you're aware of. At least some of my country's strength in GDP growth this year can be traced to fiscal stimulus. And I expect this effect to fade over the next several years. Although fiscal stimulus has clearly boosted growth in the present, I don't think we have a firm grasp on whether it is masking any building weaknesses for the longer run. And we can add to these potential risks the uncertain outcome of global tariff and trade developments. In general, global growth seems to be slowing. And although the United States could have safely ignored these developments in the past, assuming that this is true today seems like a recipe for a policy mistake. How then to manage the balance between the risks of being too timid and being too aggressive in the Fed's monetary policy course? I can think of no superior approach than to proceed cautiously and keep a keen eye on the data. I don't think we're too far from a neutral policy, and it's my view that neutral is where we want to be. And we're not there yet. I'm pretty sure we're not there. But I'm inclined to think that a tentative approach as we proceed and get closer and closer to neutral is appropriate. But I do need to say, I'm also prepared to support a more aggressive approach than my baseline view should the data deliver clearer signs of overheating. We are, for example, finally seeing some movement on wage growth. And in and of it itself, this is a good thing. But accelerating wage pressures would be a concern if coupled with other signs of building inflationary pressures. Now, I don't think I'm relaying to you anything other than common sense. But what is good risk management, after all, if not the application of common sense? Thanks for your attention. I look forward to our moderated discussion.